Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining. It gave me huge pleasure and a certain amount of trepidation to see places like Vancouver and Nashville, Tennessee come up. So it's very nice to be with like-minded people on what is a very wet afternoon in London. So thanks very much. Tomb Tourism is my title. I'm really pleased to be part of this series of talks and thank Liz Blood and the Church Monument Society very much for laying on these talks. And if I can communicate any of my enthusiasm for visiting monuments and churchyards and cemeteries, then I will have succeeded in this talk. So this isn't an academic lecture, and it's not really aimed at the tomb boffin. It's aimed at people who have an interest in these things and would like to be encouraged to look at more. Now, I'm well aware that any single one of the slides I'm going to be showing could easily be the subject of a whole lecture. So if I'm skating over things, if I'm missing out things that are comparable and relevant, I'm really sorry, but I've just got so much to cover. I better get stuck in. Now we begin with a slide, 1783, I think it is, showing a fictive scene from Goethe's renowned novelette, The Sorrows of Young Werther. And here we see his beloved Charlotte at Werther's tomb, a completely imaginary scene, which stands for me for the whole idea of people using tombs as prompts for philosophical and emotional speculation. And that's what these remarkable objects do. During this talk, I'm going to try and identify distinct strands that together can hopefully be wound to make a really strong, convincing cable or rope that can help to carry the weight of explaining why tombs and visiting tombs have become a theme of perennial interest over the centuries. And the success or otherwise of this talk will also depend whether you think this cable is convincing or not. So here we have the two ends, if you like, of tomb tourism. Now let's begin with the remarkably poignant and powerful painting by Hugh Douglas Hamilton of the Irish gentleman John Mansur St. George, mourning at an imaginary tomb of his wife, who died in 1795. And just a few years later, he would be slain during the nationalist uprising, 1798. This is a wonderful painting in the National Gallery of Art in Dublin. And this really encapsulates for me the private act of grieving at a tomb. And that's not really the subject I'm going to be talking about. That certainly isn't tourism. That's a profoundly personal encounter with the place of burial. So strand number one is the emotional intensity that connects us when we visit a tomb. Strand number two is really a kind of looser connection with the dead. We might be interested in the dead for all sorts of reasons. We might not even know who they are, but for some of them, like Jim Morrison, who drowned in his bath in 1971, a very compelling shrine, if you like, to come and visit. Apparently the bust has been pinched since this photograph was taken in the glorious Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, of course. So these are kind of the two extremes, and I'm really going to be talking more about the less private encounter with the tomb. And here is just some of the places I've been to on my holidays. Here we see some of the great cemeteries of the world that are now the destinations for increasing numbers of visitors. You open your copy of the Rough Guide to Wherever, you're often urged to go and visit the cemetery, and a very good thing too. But think how unusual that would have been even 50 years ago. The idea that we would have been singling out what had hitherto been regarded as quite private places in modern times would have I think people would be very surprised by it. So I'm feeling very positive about celebrating the heritage of places of burial, because there's more and more interest in visiting such places. Sometimes there's too much interest. So will people please, stop kissing Oscar Wilde's tomb in Père Lachaise? They've had to put up as a perspex screen and it's a shame. We feel further apart from the man than we once did. Anyway, some of the splendors of visiting. And I don't think it's helpful to refer to this habit as dark tourism. I find that a slightly troublesome phrase. So one of the great images et in Arcadia ego, after Cipriani, published, engraved by Bartolozzi, published in 1788. Now, this is really here to show the dual ideas of the tomb. One, blindingly obviously, they're reminders of death. And there we see the shepherds of Arcadia startled by the rather baroque looking skull and crossbones underneath the cartouche. But the other thing that tombs are tributes to life. And in Virgil's Eclogues, which is the inspiration for this theme, best known through Poussin, here we see the enormity of death being considered in various ways by the shepherds and their families in Arcadia. These are life-loving people beholding the seriousness, the solemnity of mortality. So I think that's strand number 3, if you like. It's about philosophical contemplation, and that's what a tomb invites us to do. To think, to look, and to ponder, and to think what the tomb of someone else means for us. Now, here is a complete fictive fantasy by Piranesi of the Appian Way, the Via Appia. This remarkable etching of 1756, just showing a concoction of all of the bits and bobs of Roman sepulchral art piled up together to give a dream or a nightmare, really, of the Roman sepulchral world. And this is here for 2 reasons, really. One is to remind us of the enduring fascination of the sepulchral remains of antiquity and how important they have been, really from Renaissance times onwards, for inspiring modes of commemoration. The other thing is to help debunk this idea that tombs are private. We're told not to take photographs in cemeteries sometimes. Oh, it's private grave. Is an element of that, but of course so many tombs are appeals to the passerby. How many Roman tombs began with those stirring words, "Siste viator," stay, traveler, and read my tomb and think of me. So these are public erections. And the 4th strand is really this appeal to memory, and our performing that act of recall, which is, in a sense, a form of individual pilgrimage. The next slide is really to get out of the way a very, very important element of the idea of visiting tombs, and is that one of pilgrimage sites of profoundly important figures of religious note. And of course, tomb pilgrimages, are very, very important in a number of world faiths. So we see a scene of Mecca, and one of the windows from Canterbury Cathedral showing the shrine of Thomas à Becket. So visiting tombs is at the heart of some of the world's great religions. We're really looking at the secular aspects of such visits. Now, the story at this point, my sort of talk will become a kind of chronological survey of how people in Britain looked at tombs. There will be some excursions elsewhere, but it's by and large a British survey. And we're beginning with the antiquary John Weaver, whose 1631 book, Ancient Funeral Monuments, is an extremely important work for various reasons. It was the first detailed study of English monuments, and above all, epitaphs. The woodcut of the Dew's monument you can see on the right. There aren't very many illustrations in what's actually rather a big, long book. It's a collection of inscriptions from southeast England in the main, but it's prefaced by a very important essay. And this really explains Weaver's motivation for why he became the first great scholar of tombs. And he was fired by dismay at this destruction that had been taking place to tombs during the English Reformation. And his essentially conservative outlook was that such damage was disrespectful and was destructive of history, that we were losing lots of key information that tombs held, as well as objects deserving respect on social grounds too. So this idea of tombs being vehicles of history, carrying information and messages of the dead to be handed on to the future, that's another of my strands. Strand 6, I do declare, the tomb as historical record. And Weaver is really encouraging the antiquary to make notes of these things and capture the information before they're gone. It's essentially an intellectual approach to tombs rather than a religious one, though that does come into his essay. Now he's publishing this in 1631, just before he dies. And he's writing at a fascinating time for English tombs. It's the great period of the metaphysical poets. People are expressing their thoughts about life, death, eternity, the hereafter, individualism, what is man in the scheme of the firmament, how do the body and soul relate? All of these topics are extremely current in the mid-17th century. This is well known from the aspect of literature. And the more we look at tombs of the mid-17th century, we can also see a comparable exploration of some of the themes that the great metaphysical poets were teasing out. And one of the great pieces of prose in English language is Sir Thomas Browne, the Doctor of Norwich. And this essay, Hydriotaphia, Urn Burial, or a brief discourse of the sepulchral urns lately found in Norfolk, 1658. He's using the uncovering of these ancient burial vessels for cremated remains as a prompt. He's just like those shepherds in Arcadia, looking at the tomb and thinking about the enormity of death and what life means. And it's interesting to read that the great American 19th century writer Ralph Waldo Emerson apparently commented about urn burial. It smells in every word of the sepulchre, which I think is a terrific tribute for an essay. Now, the next bit is really tasteless, okay? So just bear with me or go and make some tea for the next slide. This is Dear Samuel Pepys, and this is one of the more wayward acts of tomb tourism that we have on record. This is Samuel Pepys's diary of his birthday visit to Westminster Abbey, where he takes his wife and a relation. I now took them to Westminster Abbey, and there did show them all the tombs very finely, having one with us alone, there being no other company this day to see the tombs, it being Shrove Tuesday. And here we see, by particular favour, the body of Queen Catherine of Valois. And I had the upper part of her body in my hands, and I did kiss her mouth, reflecting upon that I did kiss a queen, and that this was my birthday, 36 years old, that I did first kiss a queen. So this isn't just looking at a tomb, this is actually looking at the uncovered, embalmed body of the wife of Henry V, who died in 1437. And there we see a shot of her funeral effigy. This is pretty extraordinary stuff. And can I just say, I am not condoning such behavior, but it is showing how Westminster Abbey is already a visitor destination. He's the only person there, so obviously the numbers of visitors are pretty small. And the liberty he's taking is quite something. Let's just put it down to a unwholesome curiosity. Westminster Abbey becomes quite a shrine for visitors, and a number of books were printed that really enabled the studious visitor to capture the epitaphs and inscriptions of the abbey, because you wouldn't ever have enough time on a visit to write them all down yourself. And this is just one of the guidebooks to Westminster Abbey's tombs by a German, Jocodus Krull. Jocodus is apparently the Latin for Jos. And he was a sort of hack writer, and produced this survey of the antiquities of St. Peter's, which went into a number of editions. And it includes a number of slightly rough but quite appealing prints of some of the tombs. So this is the sort of high-end souvenir for the tomb student going to the great abbey. The great churches, then as now, real magnets for visitors. One of the great sights of London, of course. And Westminster Abbey prompts the profoundly important and still moving essay by Joseph Addison, who published it in his organ, the Spectator, in 1711, his Meditations on Westminster Abbey. And you will, lots of you will know this this essay. It's quite short, beautifully written, surprisingly modern in feel in many ways. And he talks about visiting there is apt to fill the mind with a kind of melancholy, or rather thoughtfulness, that is not disagreeable. And pleasing melancholy is the seventh of my strands to explain the allure of tomb visiting. And we'll come on to pleasing melancholy later on. And he does this philosophical exercise. He wasn't the first to do it by any means. Classical authors have done it, of studying tombs as a prompt for philosophical contemplation. But he does it as a Christian. And he ends up towards the end of the essay. He writes, "I consider that great day when we shall all of us be contemporaries and make our appearance together." And he's writing about the sounding of the last trump, the resurrection of the dead, when people, the dead of all ages, will rise up and be contemporaries with each other, which is an amazing thought. And of course, there's the consolation for the Christian of visiting tombs and thinking about death, because as a Christian believer, death is a temporary state. So it is, I think, much harder for the modern viewer of the tomb to bear in mind the consolations of faith. And the fear of annihilation was, of course, for some Christians, not all, for some Christians, was securely offset by this notion of resurrection, which is a very, very important theme in sepulchral art, of course. So the graveyard school, there is a whole genre of early Georgian literature, poetry above all. It's proto-romantic, it's didactic, and it's very Christian. Edward Young's The Complaint, or Night Thoughts on Life, Death and Immortality, published 1742 to 43, is one of the star exhibits in the gallery of graveyard literature. Thomas Harvey's Meditations on Tombs is another one, published at exactly the same time, and Blair's The Grave, all being published at the same time, and really proposing the same set of thoughts, which involve studying looking at the reality of physical decay, the terror of the tomb, the grisliness of physical decay, but having got the reader in a slightly troubled frame of mind, using that as a way to elevate their thoughts to the life beyond and to end up having stronger faith as a result of this encounter with the realities of death. And lots of you, I'm sure, will probably go to bed each night having read a bit of graveyard school poetry. So I'm going to present you with another of my strands as to why tomb tourism took off and stayed a constant theme. And it's really visiting tombs to encourage repentance and to make you behave as a Christian. It's a sort of didactic urging for everyone to think about how short their days are, the grimness of the tomb, but it doesn't end in the tomb. Hence this little citation from Young's Night Thought. All on earth is shadow, and all beyond is substance. The reverse is folly's creed. So there speaks the Christian. And I think this engraved frontispiece by the really important art historian, or gatherer of data at least, about art and its production in early modern England, George Virtue, is a delight. We're seeing the casually attired gentleman in his loose robes and his turban, leaning on a chest tomb in a churchyard, underneath this wonderful moonlit starry night, pondering and contemplating death and the land to come. Thomas Gray, obviously, the Elegy in a Country Churchyard, written in the 1740s, published in 1751, really well known. And this enters the mainstream of literature, thinking about being in a churchyard, being inspired by very modest tombs to think about what death, eternity, the vanity of worldly remembrance, human worth, how is it acknowledged, all of these things. And Gray's line implores the passing tribute of a sigh. I think that's a very nice way of encapsulating one of the great drivers of visiting tombs, certainly in Georgian England, to pay the passing tribute of a sigh. And just to say how exquisite that print by Alice Miller Parker is, my favorite edition of Gray's Elegy, 1938 one. When you go to Stoke Poges, it's a kind of curious experience, because the actual tomb of Thomas Gray, you can see it on the left, is that rather unremarkable brick chest tomb in front of the chapel at the east end of the church. And it can be quite hard to summon up the atmosphere and the poetics of the place. I've taken students there. We've read the whole of the Elegy there, and you have to will them on to really use their imagination to get into the spirit of this rustic reverie about what a country churchyard can do for you. It's almost as though in acknowledgement of the lack of visual spectaculars that the owner of Stoke Park, very close to the church, got James Wyatt, the noted architect, to build this exquisite neoclassical sarcophagus with its stridulated panels and acroteria. It's a wonderful neoclassical object, and he's placed it on this very tall, hefty plinth, which actually bears parts of Gray's Elegy inscribed in marble panels. So this is not so much a monument to Thomas Gray, which is how we see it. It's really a monument to a poem, and rather lyrical it is too. So literary shrines, there are lots of these. Shakespeare is the obvious place to look. His burial place at Bradford-upon-Avon becomes a destination. Garrick organizes a somewhat unsuccessful jubilee in 1769 at Stratford-upon-Avon, a very early act of literary homage. And it's the tomb, the somewhat homespun tomb by Janssens, which people, it's the great portrait of Shakespeare, now thought to be actually quite plausible likeness of him. In the 18th century, its coloured Jacobean appearance was apparently muted by being whitewashed, because obviously polychromy was a vulgar, coarse thing, and to have a tomb painted white resembled the great marble memorials of the ancients. And we know that the two greatest romantic interiors in Great Britain, Sir John Soane's Museum and Walter Scott's Abbotsford, they both have plaster copies of the effigy on prominent display. So Shakespeare coming to pay homage to the tomb. This image on the right, and this is a sort of needlework, an embroidered picture after Angelica Kaufmann's painting that Bartolozzi engraved in the 1780s. You find these in very considerable numbers. This was a really popular image, but it again shows, paying tribute to the great literary genius of Britain, and it's the tomb that encapsulates him, really. So the literary shrine, the domestication too of the sepulchre as an image. Now, the tomb in the age of sensibility. Here we see one actual tomb, and here we see a Wedgwood plaque. So one marks the resting place in Worcester Cathedral of Mr. Solly, Richard Solly, who died in 1803, by John Bacon the Younger. It's a tremendous tomb, very, very impressive tomb indeed, exquisitely done. And it really shows a grieving family at a tomb. So it's a tomb of a tomb. Over on the left-hand side, you see another of these scenes inspired by Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther. And here we see Charlotte mourning at his urn. The urn becomes one of the canonical images of the neoclassical epoch. A sepulchral vessel becomes one of the icons of the age. I mean, downstairs, I've got a silver salt pot, sort of mid-Georgian thing, in the form of an urn. It's I look at the funeral object on my breakfast table. It's a peculiar feeling. So these tombs are becoming domesticated, if you like. The graveyard is becoming a place of considerable endeavor for those raising tombs. The Georgian Graveyard is becoming richer and richer in terms of the visual opulence of the monuments being erected inside it. And very few of them, by the way, are as sculptural as this one of my favorite Georgian tombs in Finchley Churchyard in North London, to Mrs. Elizabeth Norris, who died in 1779, here being depicted as Agrippina, clutching the ashes of her husband. So very few churchyards have actually got such full-blooded three-dimensional sculpture as this one. But they have got lots and lots of words, and it's another of the appeals of the Georgian churchyard is just how much there is to read in them, and the quality of the verse, the interest of the inscriptions. This is another of these strands. So I'm going to hit you with two more strands now. One is their sort of literary interest, the writing on tombs. And the other is their visual interest, is the sculptural quality of them and the iconography, the interest in symbolism on tombs. These are further reasons why people go on visiting them. And of course, the Georgian Graveyard is one of the great sort of cultural achievements, I would say, of British art. And as we've already seen, that there's quite a theoretical, intellectual and religious background to why you should go and visit them, and why, when your turn comes to die, you should enrich their collections of tombs by commissioning one yourself. I got given this by my step-grandmother. Apparently, my grandfather had bought this on a barrow. And so I've obviously acquired the dreadful habit of secondhand book buying. But Pleasing Melancholy, or A Walk Among the Tombs in a Country Churchyard, in the style and manner of Harvey's Meditations, by George Wright, published in 1793. This is a cracking read. It really takes you into the mindset of the Georgian tomb visitor. And as you can see, we've got a frontispiece with an inscription prompted by Young's Ninth Thoughts. We read their monuments, we sigh, and while we sigh, we sink, and are what we deplored, lamenting or lamented, all our lot. So these are places of feeling, strong, strong feeling. Slide 19, William Godwin's Essay on Sepulchres of 1809. Now, William Godwin is a familiar name to lots of people, married to Mary Wollstonecraft, author of Caleb Williams, author of Political Justice, father of Mary Shelley, fascinating figure. He's also an early utilitarian, and he writes this essay on sepulchres, very short, very interesting, 1809. And he really wants to use the power of the place of burial as a way to inspire future generations. Because the potency of a tomb is that the people buried there are actually still there. Much better than looking at a portrait. Go to their tombs and you're with them. Let us visit their tombs. Let us indulge all the reality we can now have of a sort of conference with these men, by repairing to the scene which, as far as they are at all on earth, they still inhabit. Or the third quotation, the dust that is covered by his tomb is simply and literally the great man himself. So these have this huge potency, a piquant, a sense of place. This is where the people are. Now that can sometimes be a slightly Gothic feeling about, ooh, lots of dead bodies. Or it can be perhaps more intellectually respectable feeling. This is where the mortal remains of such and such a person lie. And that's strand 12 for me. We're entering the physical presence of the remains of the dead. And he just wanted very modest memorials to be placed to make sure we knew exactly where people were, and make sure that the site of their burial was marked, if only with a wooden cross. Dr. Syntax Meditating on the Tombs, 1823. This is from the third volume of sort of lampoons that William Coombe wrote. There's a verse I suspect is scarcely read these days, but Rowlandson's images showing Dr. Syntax going about his travels is a devastating lampoon on the sort of pomposity or predictability, almost the cliche of the antiquarian in later Georgian England. Looking at tombs, noting inscriptions, these are very, very well established habits by this time. And a lot of us, I suspect, have a bit of Dr. Syntax within us. And who wouldn't be enjoying a conversation with the sexton as he digs a grave, see the skull-strewn ground of this remote churchyard, and see those improving children gambling and frolicking on a slab tomb just beside. But in the middle ground, a disconsolate widow in front of a tombstone. So piquant and quite funny at the same time. Now we've got another form of tomb tourism, and this is really visiting, this is placing tombs onto a national level. The Napoleonic Wars, 1793 to 1815, prompt a great wave of the erecting of nationally funded monuments in the churches of St. Paul's and Westminster Abbey. 36 of these tombs were voted by Parliament, costing tens of thousands of pounds. It was a very, very lavish bit of state patronage of sculpture. And these are placed to mark the deaths, the sacrifice in combat of senior officers. At this time, as most of you will know, war memorials don't really exist, but the way to honor martial valor is to honor the leaders, honor the commanders. So we're looking at two different views, historic views of the tomb, the monument of Admiral Lord Nelson killed at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. And the tomb shows the admiral, his lost right arm, obscured by the gown he wears. And he's standing on this sort of drum with splendid figure of Neptune and other maritime deities. Below, we see the Lion of Britain and Britannia pointing up to the great admiral, and her audience are two young, they're really schoolboys, but they are, you can tell by their costume and the fact that one holds a sextant, these are destined for the Royal Navy. So they are really being inspired to follow a career by the glory of Lord Nelson. And this is a state-funded monument finished in 1818 that really shows a new form of tomb visiting. It's paid for by the state to encourage others. It's an exemplum virtutis, if you like. And this, to my mind, makes a new strand to add to our growing rope of reasons. Tributes of national honour, another reason to go to the cathedrals and look at the tombs. And Smythe's book is a 1826 compendium of biographies of the people honoured in Westminster Abbey and St. Paul's, containing some slightly wonky engravings. Early 19th century, we've got a new forum for death and burial, the cemetery, the landscape picturesque garden cemetery, led by Père Lachaise. And again, these are not really private places of grief and remembrance. These are rather public places. And what makes that explicit is the installation in Père Lachaise, 1817, of the remains and the somewhat concocted, fabricated memorials to the great 12th century star-crossed lovers, Abelard and Eloise. Now, their remains have been disturbed. What's effectively a concoction of a memorial is created for them. And this is then moved from a museum context into a cemetery context, just as the remains of Molière, the great playwright, are also brought to Père Lachaise and given a brand spanking new monument as a focus for tourists, for visitors. So alongside the fascination of the growing ranks of Napoleon's commanders who were being buried at Père Lachaise, you also have these intriguing historical and literary figures being given cenotaphs effectively in Père Lachaise. And I can't go into the rise of the garden cemetery. That's just way too big a topic, and already I've bitten off much too much. But what this monument embodies for me is really the idea of a cemetery as a new form of picturesque pleasure ground, but a pleasure ground of an interesting and thought-provoking kind, of the kind that was drawing its inspiration from Le Jardin Anglais, that 18th century development of the picturesque designed landscape, studied with incidents to make people ponder and think, including many fictive tombs that were erected in the landscaped parks of 18th century England, Stowe, Shugborough, all sorts of places. So the cemetery really is a new creation, a new cultural phenomenon, combining tombs, planting, landscapes, items of interest to make a picturesque ensemble. And I'm going to declare this another strand 14 if you're counting. This is the creation of a landscape of sepulchral encounter, a place to visit. And it's a totality, not just the individual tomb. You find all sorts of interesting things in the cemetery, at least the exceptional ones. Now, it's all been very glowing and quite an easy ride for tombs so far, but people were beginning to realize that the installation of tombs inside older medieval churches had a damaging impact on medieval fabric. And with the rise of the Gothic revival, the Oxford movement, the 1840s, people are beginning to pay much greater respect to extant medieval fabric and regard later incursions in a much less favorable light, much more tolerant light. And J.H. Markland, who was a lawyer and antiquary, he wasn't a priest, but he was he wrote a much reissued short work, Remarks on English Churches, and on the expediency of rendering sepulchral memorials subservient to pious and Christian uses. And you can just tell that he was not really in favor of lots of these post-medieval tombs that were just shoved into churches, barging their way into the Gothic architecture and obliterating it. He rather wanted a more seemly, decorous, and Christian approach to commemoration. So we're beginning to have a bit of pushback against the idea that tombs are always a good thing. The popular visiting of tombs, though, goes on, and really technology is being helpful because printing becomes ever cheaper to do. When we're looking at the rise, the sort of democratic spreading of travel possibilities, literacy rates, education opportunities, more people are more interested in monuments. So it is possible to meet this growing popular interest in coming to look at places of interest with a new form of affordable literature. And this Mr. Leaf's guide over St. Paul's Cathedral, a wee little book with some pretty rough engravings in, is one of the displays of that. So more and more people are coming to look, which of course is a good thing. In fact, so many people are coming to look that coming to look at tombs is becoming a bit of a cliche. And I love this quotation, so let's read it out from Jerome K. Jerome's Three Men in a Boat of 1889. I don't know whether it is that I am built wrong, but I never did seem to hanker after tombstones myself. I know that the proper thing to do when you get to a village or town is to rush off to the churchyard and enjoy the graves, but it is a pleasure I always deny myself. I take no interest in creeping round dim and chilly churches behind wheezy old men and reading epitaphs. Not even the sight of a bit of cracked brass let into a stone affords me what I call real happiness. Well, most of the members of this audience, I'm sure, are very different, and they do enjoy such things. And I hope I'm not being too much of a wheezy old man during this talk. But the fact that Jerome K. Jerome can write this just shows how ingrained and established, how cliche visiting the tomb has become. And we can tell, we can almost count the numbers of people coming to see tombs. We can quantify the rate of people visiting churchyards by a new phenomenon, the phenomenon of the postcard that gets introduced to the picture postcard arrives, I think, 1894. And these are affordable ways of communicating very quickly with people. And those of you who collect postcards of tombs will always enjoy generally the banality of comments you find. I'm home on the train at 2:30, love Edith, that sort of thing. Here we see a couple of literary heroes from postcards showing Lakeland graves, Wordsworth grave in Grasmere, and on the right we see the marvelous 1901 Celtic cross to John Ruskin at Coniston. And I do like the inscription, a graveyard, but hope it does not make you sad. Well, I hope that applies to you lot too. So these are now affordable, these are being sent around the place, and they give an extra boost, if you like, to the popularity of tombs, and more people know what tombs look like as a result. And these postcards, very collectible things, they're really intriguing, and they're quite important for conservation reasons, because they generally show tombs in much sharper condition than is the case today. So this delightful tomb at Newhaven in Sussex, Thomas Tipper, who was clearly a local figure of some repute, who helped build the bridge at Newhaven. He was a brewer, he ran an inn, he was versed, let's have a look, philosophy and history well he knew, was versed in physic and in surgery too. The best old stingo he both brewed and sold, nor did one knavish act to get his gold. So he's a useful pillar of society and a good chap as well, and gets his wonderful tomb. This postcard dates from about 1905, pretty sharp. The inscription's been repeated. We can see very easily, and knew immortal Hudibras by heart. When I went to see it a couple of years ago, it's actually quite hard to make out now in its bottom registers. So it's one of those reminders that the act of caring for tombs is not always a living one. Another very popular tomb for postcards, you find loads and loads of different shots of this tomb outside Winchester Cathedral. To the grenadier in the North Regiment of the Hampshire Militia, Thomas Thetcher, who died of a violent fever contracted by drinking small beer when hot, the 12th of May, 1764, aged 26. And this renowned tombstone with this, weird situation about how the nature of the beer is what did for him, is captured on these headstones. And he died in 1764. We can see several replacements down here. 1781, it was restored by the officers of the garrison, placed by the North Hampshire Militia when disembodied at Winchester, 1802, and so forth. And it's been renewed since. So these are also of interest, this one, because seeing this tombstone apparently was the inspiration for a man called Bill Wilson to found Alcoholics Anonymous. He was an American serviceman over here in the First World War. So tombs can lead to great consequences. The serious study of gravestones gets underway. This book, 1896, by W.T. Vincent, president of the Woolwich District Antiquarian Society. It's not great for the quality of its depictions of headstones, but actually it's really important because so many of the tombs that Vincent sketched have really decayed since he published the book. So although the drawings aren't super deluxe, excellent bits of art, actually they are quite helpful for helping decipher what are now largely illegible headstones because of the sulphurous air of Greater London all too often. So we're starting to see, sort of looking at tombs as a hobby come along, a hobby that most of us subscribe to. And that was actually another strand, chaps, strand 15, discovery, going to look and finding out these things for yourself. Another reason why looking at tombs is interesting. I think the photograph on the right shows the tomb of the unknown sailor at Thursley, which is near Hindhead in Surrey. And this is my candidate for the most important tombstone of Georgian England. It's really sad. It's in memory of a generous but unfortunate sailor who was barbarously murdered on Hindhead on September the 24th, 1786, by 3 villains after he had liberally treated them and promised them his farther assistance on the road to Portsmouth. So he was a sailor making the 60, 70 odd mile walk from London to Portsmouth. He falls in with 3 other sailors, treats them to refreshments. They carry on walking, and when they're on the Hindhead Common, a very dramatic ridge in the Surrey Hills, they strip him of his clothing and they do him in to death. And you can see the tombstone showing in relief his clothes that they've taken off him, and they're about to do him over for good. And the postcards, again, this is a much reproduced gravestone in various editions of Postcard. You can see how clear the imagery is. It's in much better condition then than it is now. So these have a great historical value for showing us what these things look like and what they actually said, because the inscriptions get very hard to read. This stone was recut in 1955, but hugely poignant, very moving, and erected really out of a sense of aghast horror and shame that people could do such things. Despite generosity, meets a very bitter end. These tombstones can be the sort of foci of important elements of local history. So if you went to the Royal Huts Hotel at Hindhead, you could see a series of wall paintings showing this tragic episode. Beginning top right, the deed, there's the dratted, cruel sailors and murderers stripping the body, taking the clothes, hiding the corpse. Bottom right, the arrest, where quite soon afterwards they're apprehended, found guilty at the assizes. Top left, they're then hanged, and their bodies are left displayed on Gibbet Hill, and there they remain for some considerable time. And here we see at the bottom left, the devil's jumps at Hindhead, a scene of wickedness and infamy. And really that tombstone is at the heart of it. So that's just one episode showing how a tomb can embody episodes of the past. So moving on, 1916, we see an important milestone in publication of books about tombs. It's a collection of 84 photographs of wall tablets, table tombs, and headstones, selected by Herbert Batsford, the publisher, along with the architect and antiquary Walter Godfrey. And they went around photographing these monuments inside and outside churches, 1916. And that date tells us really the reason why they're doing that. It's because of the need to embark on a poignantly large wave of raising tombs to commemorate the fallen of the Great War. So by giving people examples of well-designed ones, I think Batsford and Godfrey's hope was that the quality, taste, and aesthetic success of modern memorials could be boosted. About 100 years after the book was published, I went around seeing how they were all doing. And most of the tombs are still there. Some of them suffered somewhat. You can see this one at Beaconsfield has lost its urn. And that's another form of tomb tourism is, as you can see, my son, not entirely happy to be doing this, is enforced tomb tourism. Going to visit because your parents want you to. Of course, we've all grown out of that. So moving on, but staying with the war theme, just a quick leap across the Atlantic. Of course, tomb visiting and honouring the graves of the dead. It's right in this context to remember the American custom of Decoration Day, which I believe is May the 30th, inaugurated after the end of the American Civil War in the late 1860s. And this was a way of marking the sacrifice of initially the Union dead by decorating their graves, following the Roman custom really of coming to enrich the actual site of burial with floral tributes. And this becomes an act of memorialization, which later on becomes known as Memorial Day. So that's not really a custom that's ever taken off in England. The equivalent in France would be the installation of those small Souvenirs Françaises rosettes, those little enamel signs they put on tombs over there. So here we see, again, it's like the monuments in St. Paul's or Westminster Abbey, but it's been democratized. All soldiers are being given remembrance, which is the nature of 19th century commemoration. And we mustn't talk about war memorials because it's a very different topic and it's a huge and important topic. But tomb visiting, how could we not include this poignant scene from the Liverpool Cenotaph by Herbert Tyson Smith, showing the mourners at a Imperial War Graves Commission cemetery, that sea of headstones going behind the kneeling girl as she pays tribute to a tomb. So a very, very sad and eloquent aspect of tomb visiting. Interwar, mass tourism, the possibility of people going to visit places, they could afford it. And so London Transport was very keen to encourage people to visit, to spend more, buy more tickets, do more visiting. And this rather splendid, lovely publication by Robert Byron, the interesting travel writer, Imperial Pilgrimage. It was published for the coronation that never happened of Edward VIII in 1937. It's a small guidebook, and this was urging people to go and visit the places of burial of important figures behind the creation of the British Empire and discovery of the world. If you went to Hendon, you could see the monument of Sir Stamford Raffles, founder of Singapore, as he's described. If you went to Petersham, you could see the grave of Captain George Vancouver. Hello to the Vancouver person in the audience. So this is sort of interwar period, growing popular interest and desire to go on outings. It's that simple. Why not go and see a grave? It's improving as well as interesting. If Birkin Hayward is in the audience, thank you, Birkin, for lending me, showing me this photograph of the great Fred Burgess. He's like the father of modern studies of churchyards, and he was clearly a brilliant, wonderful figure. And he wrote this marvelous book published in 1963 called English Churchyard Memorials, which is, you know, just the best thing written about churchyards. Get hold of it. It is just wonderful. And you can see him looking, I think, tremendous over there on the right. Fred Burgess was an art teacher. I don't think he ever had much money. He would bicycle around places. We think he might sleep rough sometimes on his tours of churchyards. But there he is making notes of tombs. And the book he published in 1963 is really the fruit of his studies. And from then onwards, we can really say that you had a sort of handbook to understanding churchyards. And I'm sure this encouraged a sort of the appreciation of churchyard visiting. And because they're often very hard to photograph, because the relief is so shallow, but Burgess's artistic skills really enable these wonderful capturings of the fascination of the imagery of tombs to be reached. Other writers, Geoffrey Grigson is an interesting figure about, you know, appreciating the local. Grigson was an enormously productive, prolific writer about literature, art, the countryside, nature, as well as lots and lots of poems. This book was really a sort of handbook to what a teenager ought to be interested in. So when I got hold of it, actually, it was very influential on me. And one of the things you're meant to do is buy secondhand books, check, look at maps, check, go to museums, check, keep a notebook, check, build your own museum, check, and go and look at tombs, check, check, check. So I've kind of followed what Grigson was urging us to do. And this, he speaks very warmly about the fascination of tombs. So another of the spurs that encouraged modern interest in matters sepulchral. John Piper, the artist, was commissioned, interestingly, by British Transport Films. Fascinating. This is from a 1963 film. This is just a screen grab showing the wonderful Golden Cavalier at Lydiard Dragoo's outside Swindon in Wiltshire. Rather more than Betchman, interestingly. So Piper sort of could laser in on why tombs were really interesting and brought an artist's eye to explain their interest. So now we've got church monuments on film. Modern times, we're beginning to see the crystallization of interest in visiting tombs in the formation of societies. The outlier here is the Monumental Brass Society, founded by various clergymen in the 1880s, phenomenally early, to encourage the rubbing and study of brasses. 1966, another outlier really, the Scottish Covenanter Memorial Association, set up to uphold, maintain, restore, and celebrate the extraordinary sequence of monuments put up in the later 17th century, showing the sites of martyrdom of the Covenanters. Then we begin to see the Friends of Highgate Cemetery. Cemeteries are in a dire state by this time. 1975, I think, is the first of the Cemetery Friends organisations to be founded by the worthy Whites of Highgate, led by the late Mrs. Jean Pateman. 1977, Association for Gravestone Studies. And to all American listeners, I mean, the Americans are way, way, way in front than anyone in Britain about looking at tombstones. They do much more seriously. There's far more people doing it. Extraordinary how far behind Great Britain is. Our dear Church Monument Society, founded in 1979. 1988 is an interesting body. This is really about commissioning new tombstones. But remember that not all tombs of interest are old. Even some new ones are of high aesthetic value. And that was very much promoted by the organization Memorials by Artists. 1989 is the wake-up call from the Victorian Society about the dire state that cemeteries were falling into and why they mattered. And another We Trust, the Mausolea and Monuments Trust, was set up in 97. And that's Edward Gorey, the genius presiding spirit over all such things. Why today are graveyards relevant? I think there are three new things. We've got to add some more strands, chaps. We've got to add the last of our three strands. One is genealogy and the soaring rise of interest in family history and the role of the digital access to records. And graveyards always been of interest to genealogists, but that's really increased massively in recent times. The second reason why there's modern interest in such things is what I've called very cheaply and rather crudely goth and popular culture. There's now a great relish for these things, and the imagery of the graveyard is at all sorts of levels, from the elegant and refined and artistic to the noisy and lively and very enjoyable. The third thing that's in the air is local distinctiveness. That's the last of my strands. People are interested in what's on their doorstep. They want to look at the local. They want to relish the local. And what's more local than a graveyard? And the more you look, the more you discover. It's something there on your doorstep to enrich your life. And I've just filched an extract from the poster on local distinctiveness from the organization Common Ground that was set up in 1983. So those are just some of the reasons why it's particular relevance nowadays. There's lots and lots to read about these things. Lots of you will know all of these. The book I just want to draw particular attention to is the one in the middle, The Victorian Celebration of Death by James Stevens Curl, 1972. That man really was a pioneer in looking carefully at such places and getting us to look as well. We're ending now with Johnny Ramone's monument in the Hollywood Forever Cemetery at Los Angeles. And Johnny Ramone will be known to lots of you because of his the importance of the Ramones, New York punk band of the mid-70s that inspired lots of others. This is one of the great modern tomb effigies. There he is, his legs astride, playing his Gibson guitar. It's a pilgrimage to a musician who has given pleasure to very many people. But look at the setting it's in. It's in this classical, Arcadian, eternal landscape setting of great beauty. So I think I'm going to be the first person to try and make the link between Johnny Ramone and the ancient theme of Et in Arcadia Ego. I suspect not many people have tried to do this. There's probably a reason for that. But really, it's the same idea. The tomb as a prompt for reflection, for tribute, for thinking about death, for thinking about life, and how very enriching that can be. So I end with a cheeky plug. Here are two young Californian youth devouring my wee modest books on war memorials and churchyards. Anyway, they exist, they're out there. So if anyone's interested in finding out more, they are surprisingly affordable. So have a look for those. Anyway, I hope that's been okay. It's been too long. I'm sorry I've gone on a bit, but it's all really interesting stuff. And the great thing about a Zoom lecture is you can always just walk away. Anyway, I hope that I've constructed this strong, taut cable of conviction as to why tomb tourism is a really important thing. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.